Thanks, Len. Well, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself and our church. Epicenter Pasadena started in 2003. We came from a Chinese church in Glendale. I'm Chinese. People who are Chinese don't always think I am, but I am. Right now, our church has about 700 adults and kids. We're about 50% Asian with a sprinkling of other ethnicities kind of thrown in there. In 2008, we planted New Life Community Church, an inner-city Spanish-English church in Lincoln Heights. Chris is the church planter. He's going to be telling a little bit about his story. We planted a suburban multi-ethnic church in West Los Angeles in 2012, and then they planted their own church, third-generation Spanish-English daughter church, in 2014, and then we started a Mandarin Chinese congregation here in Pasadena. And we currently also have 24 adults and 17 kids who are church planting in 10 countries that we've sent out from our church. So I think, this whole DNA and wanting to be a Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, ends of the earth church is kind of important to us. We're part of the Antioch movement of churches, and so there's 32 U.S. churches here in the U.S., and you can kind of see there, some first, second, third, and fourth generation churches that are getting planted. So what that means, if you're not familiar with the languages, they're like daughter, granddaughter, great-granddaughter, or great-grandson, whatever churches' genders are. Okay. And then Antioch churches are doing a bunch of things in other countries, and so there's about 60 church planting teams in the nations that are doing work in all kinds of places. So that's a little bit about the sort of the ethos that we come out of and our value system. Today what I want to talk about is 5 strategic principles for becoming a church planting church. And the way this is structured is I'm just going to share 5 things that we've tried to figure out, we're still trying to figure out, and how we've tried to apply it in our local context. And then you guys will have some time to do some discussion about some of those things. And then we're going to have Chris come up and basically talk about how they've tried to do it in their context, which is different from ours. Because, especially when we're in the church and in an educational institution, we can get kind of religious about what has to be done and ideological about it. And contextualization all has to do with learning principles and figuring out how to make it work in the situation you're in. So here's the first one. I really believe that it's important for us to understand and believe that reproducing is normal. That sounds pretty obvious, I think. Just as life begets life in the natural, we have to give vision for, expect, and train our people to reproduce life as part of the normal Christian life. So, as an illustration, some of us are old enough to remember seedful grapes and seedful watermelon, right? And seedful oranges. We don't really have a lot of that today because these amazing scientists have come up with seedless watermelon, seedless grapes, and so that's really great for consumers, right? I can just eat my way through a watermelon without having to have a spittoon and all this sort of stuff. We consider that normal. Kids today would consider a seedless watermelon normal. They probably wouldn't even use the word seedless because that's what it is. What's really interesting is that while that's normal in the consumer field when it comes to fruits and vegetables, when families aren't able to have children, what do we call that? That's called infertility. And you probably know people, maybe you yourself have been involved with somebody that has infertility, and that's a great, great tragedy. Potential moms and dads cry, spend a lot of money trying to fix that, and we know there's something intuitively wrong about that, right? The thing I've found is that somehow in 21st century church, infertile churches and infertile people have become normal. So that if we find somebody who is able to lead other people to Christ, we consider that person has a gift of evangelism and there's something abnormal about it. And if there's a church that's planting other churches and is fertile, there must be something special they're doing. But that reveals that something's amiss, in my opinion. Seedless watermelons and seedless grapes are really great for consumers, but it's not natural. And I think the issue that we sort of have to think about is, in our ethos, in our mind, what do we really believe about life? You can look out the window here. There's all kinds of beautiful plants, and plants that grow where you don't want them, we call them weeds. But life grows. Life reproduces. That's the way God's made it. And so the question is, I think it should be part of our expectation that it's normal for Christians to reproduce other Christians. I don't just mean moms and dads, right? That leaders reproduce other leaders, that cell groups reproduce other cell groups, and churches that reproduce other churches. I think this has to be part of an organic mindset of what the church is. And when we don't have a mindset and a worldview that's way, that belies that somewhere something about our expectation of the church has gotten skewed. When something is not amiss, or something's not reproducing, something's amiss. Either something's been taken out of the DNA, or something's been added to the DNA, or there's some kind of growth inhibitor in the soil. And I think this is a very important ecclesiological point. If we don't think it's normal for churches to reproduce, what's happened to the DNA? What's been adjusted such that our expectations are, if you're a church planner, if your church planted churches, wow, there's something amazing about that. What's happened? So what I want to do is spend the next bit of our time just kind of focusing on some of those pieces of the DNA. This is not exhaustive. Just a couple things I think that we've had to try and figure out as a church. The first one is this, is that Jesus taught and modeled go, not come. He taught and modeled go, not come. So, in the Old Testament, we have a model of church. It's called the temple, right? And the Old Testament model of the temple was that there was one of them in Jerusalem and kind of one in Samaria, depending on how you looked at it, right? And it was a big pilgrimage for everybody to come to the temple. People would take pilgrimages to it. People would look at the stones. It was this big, impressive edifice, and everybody came to it. One temple, everybody went to it. Now, what's very interesting is in the New Testament, you find something very different. You find a go model. Now, why do I say that? Well, in John chapter 2, verse 21, Jesus has this interesting conversation, and the Pharisees say, well, what gives you the right to go and do all this stuff, to make a ruckus in the temple? And he says, well, I'll tell you a sign. I'm going to tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And they're like, how are you going to do that? And then John inserts this parenthetical comment. He says, but the temple he was speaking about was his body. Okay? See, there's an ecclesiological shift that takes place right here in John 2. And then when we see in Matthew chapter 9, Jesus goes, and he goes to every town and village in Judea, and he sees that people are harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Right? You're very familiar with this. But see, the ecclesiology is now the temple has legs. The temple is walking around and going to where people are at. This is what people call incarnational and missional as opposed to attractive. That's the theological vocabulary, but I can't use stuff like that in our church, right? I just have to use words like go and come because they understand that, right? So the ecclesiology here is that Jesus goes right to where people are at and he sees where they are. They are not doing things, bringing elephants and camels in on Easter. Sorry, that was kind of snide, but I think you understand where I'm going with this, right? Then Jesus says, the fields are ripe to harvest, and so it's important for us to pray for laborers, right? Go and ekbalo laborers, pray that the Lord ekbalos laborers in the field, and then these guys become the answer to their own prayers, and Jesus sends them out 2 by 2, and we'll look at this in just a little bit. So you can see that Jesus himself, as the temple, starts walking around the temple as legs, and the temple is incarnating in different situations and people, and then he teaches his disciples to do that, and then right at the end, of course, of the scriptures, we read the Great Commission. Go into all the world and preach and disciple people, baptizing them and teaching them to obey all the things I've commanded you. And this is really the story of the book of Acts. Right? Jesus tells them Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. They get stuck in Jerusalem until the persecution takes place. Right? Because they don't go, the way somebody said it is, if you don't do Acts 1:8, then you get Acts 8:1. right? Which is them being forced to go out when they didn't want to. And that's the reason why you see that the movement actually take place in the book of Acts. So, reproducing DNA is missional and not attractional. And I think this is something that we as a church still have to get a hold of, because we want to have people come to us, and we've missed the case that the DNA of the church has to always be pushing outwards and getting into where people are at. We just had, we're doing training right now this weekend at our church, training on how to help our people share their faith and so forth and so on. Last week we had a bunch of people just go to the Paseo over here. And, they found a lady who was hobbling around, and they said, "Can we pray for your back? What's wrong?" And she says, "Oh, my back's really messed up." She was a Hispanic woman of about 34, 35 years old, a couple of kids. And so they said, "Can we pray for you right here?" And they started laying hands on her back right there at the Paseo, and the kids got embarrassed and they ran away. But this lady ended up getting completely healed as they continued to pray for her. And then as a result, she said, "How did you do that?" And they ended up leading her to Christ. This was this past week. My wife's an emergency room physician, so we're doing a bunch of training tomorrow, and she got clearance to go to the hospital that she works at, Glendale Adventist. They're going to go to the ICU and the emergency room and pray for everybody in the waiting rooms. And the chaplain said, "Yeah, it's awesome. You guys come on in and do this." Wow. That's really cool. I'm excited to see what happens there. But you see, that's part of understanding that while it's important for us to meet as a church on Sundays and meet as cell groups during the week, that essential action of going has to be part of that missional DNA. And that's the kind of DNA that reproduces. Having people come to us, I don't think it reproduces that well.
Sorry, John, I just wanted to do a quick announcement. Hey, for folks on Blue Jeans, if you mute yourself, then other folks won't hear the background noise. So if everyone on Blue Jeans can mute their thing, that'll help the other folks. Sorry about that.
And that's all right.
Announcement.
Yeah. Okay. So I think this thing about going and not coming is a very important part of the DNA. I think here's a second one. Jesus told his disciples when they first went out to find people of peace. Now, this is actually the first short-term mission in history. So it's really helpful for us to understand Jesus was very intentional about the instructions he gave to his first short-term missions. And so we'd be well if we're trying to do things the way he suggested it, right? And so here we read in Matthew chapter 10, these 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: "Don't go among the Gentiles or enter any town of the Samaritans, but go to the lost sheep of Israel." It's because Jesus was racist. I don't think that's not what it was. But I believe that he was saying it's important to look for responsive people. And you'll actually find this in the book of Acts that Paul did this himself when he was out planting churches. So understanding the principle of receptivity or responsiveness is really important. Then Jesus says, "As you go preach this message, the kingdom of heaven's near. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. Freely you have received and freely give." And so, however you parse the kingdom and all that complicated theology, what I tell the folks in our church is, preach that Jesus is close. Preach that God is near. His rule and reign is close. And this is, at least in English, this is a 6-word sermon, right? He's saying, tell people that he's close. And then, of course, people would say, well, how do I know that? Right? And well, here it is. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons. This is the authentication that the message is really true. So, we've been in Africa many, many times when we say, we are planting churches right now in Muslim villages in Africa, and, we go out to places where there's no health care, and we say, God is really close to you. And what I add is, are you Muslim? And they say, yes. How many times a day do you pray? 5 times a day. How far away does God feel? And they say to me, really far away. I'm like, God's close to you. And they say, how do we know? I say, well, bring your sick people here. Right? And we've seen blind people healed, deaf people have their ears open, and it opens people's hearts to the gospel. So, Jesus tells the disciples in the first short-term mission ever, do this, preach the nearness of the kingdom, show that he's near. And Don't take any gold or silver or copper in your belts. Take no bag for the journey. What this really is all about is them having to be in a place of dependence where they're not setting their own agenda, where they can, take care of themselves. They're going into villages where the only way they're going to have a place to sleep is by depending on God and looking for what's called a person of peace. So here we see this coming after. Whatever town or village you enter, search for some worthy person. In Luke, he's called, this is called a person of peace. Look for the worthy person there and stay at his house until you leave. As you enter the home, give it your greeting. If the home's deserving, let your peace rest on it. And if it's not, let your peace return to you. And so he says, you need to find people of peace. Now, let me just unpack this a little bit. What does this really mean? And I think it's helpful for us to think, if Len and I went to a place where there was no Christians, what would we do to try and bring the gospel there? All right? We'd preach the nearness of the kingdom, see things happen, and then we're looking for this person of peace. So, this is what people have said about it. The characteristics of a person of peace is a person of responsiveness, that when you share the gospel, they're interested in it. Of relational influence, they're well connected and they quickly refer Christ to others in their network. And a person of reputation in a place, either good or bad. So, here's some first domino people in the scriptures. Matthew, really open. The first thing he did is start a party. Everybody knew he was very, very open. He responded, and he was a person of what kind of reputation? Bad, right? Bad reputation. Lydia was a person of good reputation, right? She was the first believer in Philippi. The Ethiopian eunuch, the first believer in Ethiopia, right? Cornelius, a great Roman centurion with a good reputation. The woman at the well, bad reputation. But she immediately goes and tells everybody in the village, come see the man who's told me everything I ever did. And the Gerasene demoniac. He was the first cutter in the Bible, by the way. So, the traditional approach to evangelism is, okay, here's everybody, here's this city, this village. We're going to go and knock on doors until we find somebody. And when the Spirit of God shows up, whoa, there he is, Fire falls down. And then what we're going to do is bring them to our existing institutional church and take them out of their relational network. We want to say, there's all these evil people. Don't spend time with them because you're going to get corrupted by them. Let us disciple you until you become a holy person. And by that time, they've lost relationship with everybody who's a non-believer. So the whole person of peace approach is more like this. Okay, here's that same village. And what you go is you go and find out, God, where are you moving? And sometimes we'll ask a question about who's having a dream. Or who do you know here that really needs God really badly? And everybody goes, oh, it's that guy over at that house, right? And so they'll tell you, and then God shows up. And if that person's a person of peace, they end up becoming the one who ends up doing all the work. Because everybody sees their life change. And as we sit, and what Jesus says is stay at their house and disciple them. Because as that happens, then all kinds of people will get reached. And so you can see then how that sort of situation can begin to multiply in a city or a village through relationships. Okay? And this is really what it is that missiologists have told us the way that churches were planted back in the New Testament. And so, again, we want to let what's in the Scripture be our primary way of thinking about things. So, I remember a number of years ago, my wife and I started discipling a couple named Alex and Michelle. And we started discipling them, teaching them to pray for their friends every single day, put them up on prayer cards, pray for them, and let's ask God for, here's how you share your faith and so forth. And it was amazing because that first year as we started discipling them, a bunch of Michelle's friends from Arcadia High School came to faith. And so we saw a bunch of them come to faith that second year. And then we started teaching them about people of peace, and they started continuing to pray and ask God. So in the third year, there was a number of other people that came to faith. That fourth year, they started doing the Alpha course, but it was all relational. And they said, we're going to pray for our friends and bring them in. And so that third year, there was a number of other people that came to faith. And then in the next year after that, you can see here, there was just a few. Jesse, who led Michael to faith. In year 5, there was a whole flock of people that started coming to faith. and then in year 6. And this is something, this is how our Chinese congregation got started, was by our discipling 2 people and teaching them how to share their faith and to look for people of relational influence, because as people's lives begin to change, things begin to snowball and domino. And so really the point here is that reproducing DNA, it has to be focused on persons of peace rather than some sort of brute force evangelism method, because we want to engage and use the harvest fields for the harvest field to be reached. All right. Here's the 4th one. Jesus discipled as his main thing. Right? I don't think, I need to tell you this, that really the thing that Jesus spent his time in the Gospels was discipling people. Robert Coleman thinks that Jesus spent 50% of his time with his disciples. So those of us who are church pastors, that's kind of a challenge, because we've got all kinds of board meetings and other things we have to do. But if this was how Jesus suggested that people do things, the question is my life reflecting that? And if we're not doing things the way he did, maybe that's why we're not getting the results he did, right? So the first thing Jesus does is disciple, and we see this picked up in the epistles as well. Here from 2 Timothy 2:2. Paul says, "The things you heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable men who will also be qualified to teach others." So, of course, the person that's talking here is Paul, right? And he's talking to Timothy, right? He's the you, right? So he's saying, I've been discipling you, Timothy. Find other reliable people that you can disciple who can then be entrusted to disciple others. And we know that Paul was actually discipled by Barnabas. Most scholars think Barnabas was actually discipled by the apostles, who actually got discipled by Jesus, right? So you actually have 7 generations of discipling embedded right in the verse. And see, ultimately the reason why you and I are here is because that's continued to take place. So discipling is really the key to changing the world. And so, I believe that if we want to see reproducible DNA, it's got to be focused on persons of peace, it's got to be focused on going, and it's got to be focused on discipling. So, it's got me to think about a woman that I met maybe 2.5 years ago by the name of Monique. And she's right over here. And Monique came out of a very dysfunctional family. She had been having a lot of troubles with alcohol, and so she got a DUI because she smashed into a house, and ran her car into a bedroom and got her life really messed up. And Carol, who's right next to her, started discipling her about 2 years ago and helped Monique to kind of get a hold of Jesus and find out who he really is, to develop some things in her life. She discipled Monique for about a year, and then Monique joined a discipleship school that we actually have in our church. And at that particular discipleship school, she was in school for 5 months and then went overseas in Thailand for 6 months as part of a mission team. And is a neat little picture of her in Thailand with some of the people that she started reaching out to. It's awesome to see young people's lives change around and for them to be involved and imprinted with that kind of DNA. She's, just working her way through school, wants to get a degree, and then go out on the mission field and plant churches. And it's like, yeah. Here's the last thing, and I'll just say this briefly. It's very important for us to not just think about training, but let the way you do church be the training. Instead of creating an actual training system right away, start by making the actual life that church members live function as the training in and of itself. And so, we've tried to strip down at our church life things to be fairly simple so that it's mostly about discipling and cell groups. And that's because that's what I see in the scriptures. Jesus had one-on-one time with the Father. He discipled 3 people. He had a cell group of 12. And then they went out and tried to reach people. And so that's what we're trying to reproduce and trying to get people to disciple others so that's what we do. And that's what I want people to major in, so that when they go overseas, they do what they know, right? So we really talked about 5 strategic principles for becoming a church planting church. The first one is clarifying your DNA, that reproduction and multiplication is normal. Right? The second one is that we want to see church life focused on going and not coming as its predominant mode. being missional and not attractional. That Jesus told his disciples to find persons of peace as a basic strategy. And then, once you have them, to disciple them and teach them to disciple other people. And then not creating training to do things, but letting church itself, your church life, be an equipping process. So we have a couple questions for table discussion right now. Here's the first one. The basic premise is that reproduction, since reproduction is normal, if it isn't happening, the DNA has been altered. So I'd like to just have you kind of reflect a little bit about your church experience. What altered DNA can you identify in the churches that you've been involved in? Right? If you're with somebody, or you're with your pastor today, you can talk about a prior church. Okay? But I think it's helpful. What kind of altered DNA can you identify in the churches you've been involved with? And secondly, I said if we want to see movements in and through the church, then reproducible DNA must be part of every level of church life, from discipleship to groups to the church. What do you think that might look like in your context? So I think we're going to spend 15 minutes or so just in table discussion so that we can kind of flesh some of these concepts out, in our own talking and in our thoughts. All right? Okay, I'm going to just pull this back, and for those of you on Blue Jeans who are talking to your children and your dogs, I hope you had a great conversation. So I didn't put this up there, but I think it is also crucial in this whole thing about church planting. I read a statistic once that said if a church doesn't plant a church in its 3 years, statistically it probably won't. And we didn't exactly make it. We sent Chris, why don't you come on up, Chris, as a church planner, out from our church about 3.5 years in our church life, and he's going to tell you a little bit about that amazing story. But I think one of the things I do want to say is, as a church, because church planting is a very big deal to us, we are intentionally trying to cultivate church planting among our people. Whether it's giving children evangelism and prayer training, whether it's, we just had one of our 6th graders throw a huge party. I think it was in the Temple City School District, actually. He and a couple of his friends started praying for their friends and did a big beach party and led 7 of their friends to the Lord this past week. And so, that kid looks like he's probably could be a church planter, right? And so we're trying to pay attention from our little kids to our middle schoolers. We're very involved with Azusa Pacific, where we're trying to look for church planters so we can disciple them up, and then also in graduate school, and so as well as our own people. And so we're very intentional about trying to cultivate and train up and raise and equip and send church planters out, because that's the work of the church, And so really glad to introduce Chris, and he's going to tell you a little bit about his story. So here you are.
I'll use that.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you. John is correct. I wouldn't be here. This wouldn't happen if he had not sort of identified me, empowered me, released me, and then continued to support me in that way. Church planting from scratch is a very, very difficult endeavor. But this is me here finishing graduating from here, my intercultural studies degree. I went just to 10 years. I just made it. I got the call at about the 7-year mark. They said the whole program's changing, so if you don't finish soon, you're going to start all over because you can't retake the classes. I'm like, oh boy. I wouldn't have made it to Fuller without John saying, let's go, let's go. For us, as we were talking about church planting and praying and processing it, the Lord called my wife and I to plant a church among the urban poor of LA, specifically a cross-class church, but even more specifically a church of the working class poor in LA that would be led by the working class poor. And, so our context is unique. So we went to Lincoln Heights, which is in the city of LA on the east side, and it's about 30 to 35,000 people. It is in the top 5% of poverty communities in the city of LA. About 70% of its adults only have less than a ninth grade education and have not graduated high school. And so we went there, and we knew that because of the context, we needed to be wise, we needed to be servants, we needed to learn. And so there was just 7 of us, my wife and I, and then 5 others that moved in to the community. We wanted to be very, very small because we had learned from others that we had gotten in contact with who had tried this, that the walls between the educated and uneducated, or those who have not, their class walls are much greater to overcome than just purely racial walls, although there are walls there on both. But class walls are very tough to overcome. It's, when you hear the term multi-ethnic church today, often that is similar class. That's kind of what happens as they plant multi-ethnic churches. It's very difficult to have cross-class churches. And so we knew, based on wisdom, that we needed to labor for years to build up a community from the neighborhood, led by the neighborhood, before we started having more folks like me coming into the church. And so we were just a team of 7. The other reason why we were small is because we wanted the church to be a church of new Christians. And so when there's just 7 of you every week, you really fast and pray and do more evangelism. You know what I'm saying? But if you bring 40, then it's real quick. You can get into just caring for each other, and you're not seeing the church grow the way you want to see it. Going off of John's principles, we tried to find responsive folks in our community of Lincoln Heights. That meant we wanted to find existing communities that were already going on that we could plug into. One, because we knew that we had to learn. We were coming in as outsiders. We wanted to learn, where is God already at work? What can we learn from our new community about God? And God always shows himself in community, in any kind of community. You learn heart values. You learn kingdom values. And so we were all over the place. These are 3 guys. I found a gym, a weight room that the men were going to. It was an old prison that had been refurbished into a weight room. And I remember the first day I showed up, and I turned the corner into the room, and there was about 40 guys looking like them, and my skinny butt, and everybody, the music is on, everybody's talking, and as soon as I come in the room, everybody stops and looks at me. And the guy at the door, right next to the door, just says, "What the heck are you doing here?" And I kind of froze, thinking, "Yeah, what am I doing here? What am I doing?" Right? And I, thankfully, Lord, I just said, "Isn't it obvious? I need some muscles, man. I need some help." And he started laughing. He goes, "Oh, we can take care of that." And then he started introducing me around the room, and I became their project. And I became an addict on ibuprofen for months. They would tear me up so much. And this guy on the left here, Tony, he came in about a month into it, coming out of prison, and he saw me, and he can bench press 500 pounds. I saw him do it, so he was kind of big dog of the room, and he saw me, and he came up to me and goes, "What are you doing here?" He didn't trust me at all. Thought I was an undercover cop or something. And I told him, "Well, I'm a pastor, and I am here to plant a church in this neighborhood, but I can't do it alone because I need to learn from people like you what God is doing and what he needs. I need partners from the community. I have a little bit to bring, but I don't have everything to bring." And he just looked at me and walked away, and I thought, uh-oh. And the next day, I'm in the weight room, and he comes in and just storms right at me. And I thought, oh, and he goes, "You caused a fight between my wife and I last night." I'm like, oh no, right? And he said, "We were arguing all night." We were like, "Are you really a pastor or not?" Because pastors, they don't come into these kind of weight rooms. They go to those fancy 24-hour fitnesses. And what is your agenda? Blah, blah. And there's no way you can be a pastor. And I was like deer in the headlights, and I just kind of fumbled like, well, if you don't believe that, then you don't know the Jesus that I know, because Jesus is here. I told you yesterday, I'm trying to learn about Jesus through you and give some of what I know about Jesus to you. So do you want to learn together? And he just looked at me and goes, "I don't know that Jesus. Whatever you're talking about, I'll learn." And then he started this group here of new Christian Bible studies we got going. We went to the same laundromats every week. Zumba classes. We went to the popular food spots. We went to the park programs. We would go to the same popular food spots and get to know the servers and the owners. Eventually, as our church grew, if we ever have a group of outsiders that want to do a VBS, we never do it at our church building now. We just do it in an apartment complex in the courtyard. We're always wanting to go into existing communities. Where we found the most responsive community was in the high school football community. And so all these other communities, we had these great conversations, but nothing would stick. And then somebody told us, hey, you should go to the high school football game. Everybody's there. Sure enough, they were there. And I remember I went that first game, didn't know anybody, and I see this mom driving up right before the game and pulling out trays of food by herself. I go, can I help you? And I found out she's like the team mom. She goes, yeah, our boys, they faint a lot. They don't eat enough food. So, I dump half my paycheck every week to feed this team. I'm like, whoa. And so I just started helping her. And then next thing you know, she finds out I'm a pastor Christian trying to plant a church, and she cusses worse than the football players, right? And she's just like, well, bleep, you need to pray for these bleeping kids because they're crazy. She takes me down into the locker room as they're getting ready for the game and says, oh, all of you get over here, right? They call her Coach Lucy. And she said, this is a man of God, and you need God, and he's going to pray for you right now. And these kids looked at me. I'm like, let's pray, right? And so we prayed, and as I'm praying, though, because of John's training, I thought, Lord, I just found a person of peace. And I'm praying for Lucy in my heart as I'm praying for these boys. Lucy becomes a Christian 2 months later. And so then me and her decide and convince folks to run a team-building football camp. And this is where we're at. And we're in this circle as a coach is confessing to the boys that the reason why he was treating them so badly is because he drinks himself to sleep every day and comes to practice hungover or drunk. And looked at me across the circle and said, I want your Jesus. What do I do? And as he gave his life to Jesus in the circle, I turned to the guy next to me that was helping me, and I said, I think the church just started. And that's how it was. And so going to the responsive, finding those people of peace because of Lucy, right? As we began to build and work with people, we would always preach the nearness of the kingdom, as John was talking about. And so as you see, this top bullet was sort of my most common phrase to people when they say, what are you doing here? What's going on? And I would always use the word transformation. God has sent us here to build a church to transform individuals' lives, families' lives, and this community. But I'm also here to learn. Would you be willing to do this together? And it's amazing when you say that to somebody, you don't even know where they're at spiritually, how they respond. It is absolutely amazing. Like John said, they'll either say they're interested or they go, oh no, but that person, go talk to that person, right? We just before we did any kind of formalized stuff for a long time, we would just meet people and ask them, what's the best thing about our community and what's the one thing you want to see changed? And when we asked the thing about seeing changed, they said mostly, we realized they said they wanted help for the teenage boys in the neighborhood. And that's what led us to the football program. And then we had a time, what's the one miracle you need in your life right now, version of that got us into a lot of prayer. As this football thing was going, one of the main leaders, captain of the team, hurt his ankle real bad, broke it. And he let us pray for him, and it was healed. And that was a big boost, right, for what was going on in terms of showing God that he is near. God really gave Lucy and then another football coach a real prophetic gift that began to really help people around see that God is near. What we've learned in our context is that we've got to fast, pray, and we've got to persevere. This took years. I'm giving you the greatest hits that took years. And so for every new little small group that raised up, we got about 15 that failed. and just constantly always going from, community to community, finding the person of peace, right, getting people interested, and then a month later, it falls apart, and we can't find them, and then we just do it again, and dealing with that kind of heartbreak and that kind of deal. About going into the third year, for the first time in my life, I got into depression, and it was very confusing for me because I never dealt with that, and it was part of the grind of just having hopes get dashed and then rise and dash, and needing that kind of support from John. This here, right here, is a little picture in our apartment complex. So we moved into a larger apartment complex in the community, and it was kind of known as the hub of drug dealing in the community. So none of the kids would ever come outside. It was very dangerous. It had a lot of alleys, and prostitution and drug dealing and partying were going on the weekends. And we prayed and tried to get to know people. People were very suspicious of everybody. They thought I was an undercover cop for a while. I got caught walking through a drug deal. That was very scary. But then one day, a guy says hi to me on a Saturday as I'm walking back, and I'm like, "That's interesting." You learn when you got to pick up on that stuff. It's like somebody's friendly. All right, I'm going to start there, and so we started to talk. And his son had a football. They had just come from the park and were playing football. Playing catch. Next thing I know, these kids are streaming out of the apartment, and we're playing football in the alley. We get done. It's the first time I'm meeting some of the older young men, like 25, right? I'm meeting them. Get back to the apartment, and my wife's like, "Do you realize what time it is?" And it was like 1 a.m. on a Saturday. And I ran back out on my balcony. I realized no drug dealing, no partying. The kids had sort of taken over the alley, and everybody respected it. We played football there every night for the summer, and they never came back. And then eventually, we had pizza and Bible study on Friday nights. And eventually that started a group in our apartment that turned into some folks for the church. Here is a little clip of our football in the alley that you'll see there. So we had multiple times, we almost had kids killed by cars driving through. And people loved it. And the ladies out there playing. That was the man that was very kind to me, right there, that just caught the ball. And you'll see, like this right here, we almost had a death right there. So that's where it started. What we learned in our context, just finishing up here, when we're looking for people of peace, really is just reiterating people interested in Jesus, not just a friendship with you. What we talk about is we're looking for genuine seekers, not snackers, not people that just want the love that Christians give, but actually really want Jesus. And then we're looking for people who want to help others, not just themselves. These people of peace don't always end up being forced soil. This man right here, right, you'll see he's in that bottom right picture with his family. He was a people of peace that we had for a while. We had a large study going with all the cholos in the neighborhood, a bunch of the gangbangers. But yet all these folks here are part of the church except him still. But he always respects us and connects us to folks. And so different ways there. Here are people of peace that actually were forced soil. And so you'll see all the brown folks in the picture. They were the folks that basically, through their life story and their conversion, these were all people who had very bad reputations. These were people that you would go to for partying. And now, because of them, that's what we have. So we teach a lot about reproducing and discipling. This man here is discipling that man, and he's got a life group now. And this is a team of folks that is discipling folks from the neighborhood. They're a great little small leadership team. And then this is Enrique from the community who is now planting our second church. And I'm just doing for Enrique what John has done with me. What you do in your churches is you find folks that just always have vision for something new. And they're never just satisfied. They want to build something. They want to change something. And you got to say, hey, and they're very good with people. You need just relational people. You say, you know what? I think we're going to plant a church through you. And they'll be like, what? And Enrique. And then you get him out there and you support him like crazy. And Enrique is doing amazing with his church. Last thing is that every year we take groups of folks from our neighborhood to our churches around the world. And for our folks, it's usually the first time out of the city. And it's an absolutely amazing thing to get them in touch with global poverty, to have them heal and pray for people, lead people to Jesus there, and realize that God has raised them up to give. And it really breaks sort of some lies that are in their head about sort of their worth and value in the larger body of Christ. That's sort of how we try to apply the principles in our context in East LA.
That was phenomenal. I mean, I was moved. Thanks for sharing. Thanks for your obedience. Is there and I might have missed it earlier, sorry I was late, is there a specific vision that you're laboring towards that's getting passed downstream that's like a sticky vision? And if so, can we hear it?
Me? Yeah. Yeah, our vision is one of the things that our folks in our community have identified is just a major area in the community that needed is unity and family and good relationships. Like we've learned, for example, it's very difficult for us to take a new Christian and have like them do a Bible study in their home. Very, very difficult. A lot of times there's no space. There's a lot of dysfunction, a lot of broken relationships. And so we are looking to build small community-based churches all over the east side of LA. And so we are hoping for 4 or 5 more, kind of a deal. But then to keep them connected. So our churches right now, we have a discipleship school that's combined. We do an annual church retreat together. And as we're building, we're just 12 minutes apart, local drive. But there's these very contained communities on the east side: Boyle Heights, Lincoln Heights, East LA Unincorporated, El Sereno, the downtown community, right? And so we want a church that's really community-based in each of those, that's invested in the community, that's working together for the larger transformation of the community, that's providing some light there. And our folks are fired up about it. Yeah, they're especially now that they've seen the second one, it's an exciting vision for them.
I have a 2-part question. One's for Chris. When you mentioned about going through depression after your 3rd year, what were the support that you had, and how did you come out of that? Yeah. And second question is for John. You talked a lot about culture, how you don't want church to be program driven and to be about just creating more things, but the culture, the DNA of the church should be about discipleship, and it should be this soil that people can grow roots and go deeper in Christ. So if you guys could touch on those 2 things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, the root of the depression was that this was the first time in my life that I was failing in what I was working so hard at. I've always been a hard worker, and hard work usually pays off. But now I was in a context where it wasn't, and I was learning a ton. And so I didn't know it at the time, but the root of my depression was really an identity problem. My identity was really rooted in the success of ministry. And I wouldn't have said it, right? I was discipled in that, but I did not have the intimacy with Jesus that I needed to absorb the suffering of a long-term church plant. So I was praying 15 minutes a day. That included my Bible reading. And then I was getting out there working and meetings and all that kind of stuff, and it just wasn't happening. And so it was John and the support from Epicenter Pasadena, and we had a conversation at the time. At first, I went into get my regular physical, and I had a doctor, not a Christian, and how is you doing? And I emotionally vomited on this doctor. And afterwards, she was like, you need medication, right? And I was like, what? What was going on? And it was John and everybody that went through some counseling here, realizing that I had trauma-induced depression, not biological, right? And so what it was scaling back and getting real about my lack of intimacy with Jesus. It was like Len talked about the spirituality of a church planter. And this was John and folks around that were like, we need to talk about what do you need. And it's time for a bedtime, because staying up after 10 till midnight watching shows actually is not helpful for you. You need to get up earlier before your kids get up so you can have a longer time with Jesus. And what does that look like to have a longer time with Jesus? And then we got to have a regular Sabbath, and we have to have prayer retreats. And so it literally, the depression was finally the Lord saying, you have just been self-sufficient for too long, and your identity has to be rooted in that you are my child, and that's all that you need. You do not need the success of this church plant to be happy. Not in the end, not ultimately, right? And so I began to grow in my spirituality, and then for about a year, every day my prayer, my mantra was, God, help me to be the most joyful person in this community, whether I have 0 people show up or 100, because I'm loved by you. And it was just a long, slow journey of that, and then all the support that was around me. And so it's been the spirituality disciplines that have not only saved me, but helped me thrive to where I'm doing this for life. And my wife and I, we're never moving. We're in this for life. Want to see a bunch of church plants. Yeah.
Yeah, so in terms of the discipleship question, I mean, I think it's something we as a church constantly have to re-up in. Because it's very easy for us in our Western context to sort of think that people get discipled from a stage. And they never do. It's not how people grow, right? And so trying to scale back and focus on the one-on-ones and the one-on-twos, and that comes down to my schedule, that comes down to my staff's schedule, that comes down to where our attention is. And, you know, I'd say as our church has grown, we constantly are having to re-up, and we're having another whole round of discussions on this discipleship thing this summer. Because it's like, we've got to get back there in the trenches. Everybody's got to be discipling. We've got to clean up our tools and get people to disciple other people, you know.
And I'll just add on that. I think the thing that has been so helpful together fleshing out discipleship is that we are very clear practically about what that looks like. What it does not look like is meeting together with a person you're discipling at a coffee shop every week and reading a book together. That can be a part of it. But what it looks like is helping each other, in praying and learning how to have rhythms with Jesus, doing evangelism, loving the people around you, forgiving people around you, doing the Sermon on the Mount, right? And so discipleship is about walking with somebody in those things. So I often will, when I start discipling somebody, I'll often show up at their house for 2 weeks in the morning. They'll tell me what time, and I'll teach them how to pray in the morning, right? And then we'll go out and we'll figure out their network, and hey, I'll hang out with you, and let's learn how to love some folks and pray for them. And so it's kind of a holistic piece that also includes knowledge and Bible study and book discussion as well.
Similarly, there was just a question that came in, John, just to talk about kind of what are the rhythms of your walk with Jesus? What does that look like? How does that sustain you?
Yeah, so, I grew up kind of, maybe as many of us did, saying, I'm not going to be religious about this whole thing. And when I first met the senior leader of our movement, he's made a comment that really struck me. He said, I don't know anybody who isn't changing the world who isn't spending at least an hour a day with Jesus. And I remember just going, for some reason that struck me right. And I had always been a night owl, and I realized I needed to change my life around my time with Jesus and make it the most important thing in my schedule. And, what I tell our people now is, if you say that Jesus is first in your life, put him first in your schedule and schedule everything else around it. And so, for a number of years, I wouldn't schedule things after 9 o'clock at night because, my son was 5 at the time, and we needed to get him up at 6:30, and so I needed to get up at 5:30, which meant I needed to actually get up at 5, and if I need 7 hours of sleep, I needed to go to bed at 10. And it'd take me 15 minutes to wind down, so I'd set an alarm for myself at 9:45 in the evening. It's time to shut everything off and go to sleep, because otherwise having time with Jesus every day isn't sustainable. You can go to bed at 1 o'clock in the morning and wake up at 5 for 3 days in a row, and then after that you're toast, right? And so, this morning I was up at 5:15 and just having my time with Jesus, pouring out my heart, studying the scriptures, praying through the people of my life, and and then we just had a staff discussion about this the other day. of course I want to be a person that communes with the Lord all day long through my life, but I found I can't do that if I don't begin by communing with Him. Again, it's not a religious thing for me, it's survival. And on Tuesday, I confessed to our staff, I didn't start my day the way I wanted. I had a really busy week, and I woke up feeling anxious, and I let my anxiety drive what I did in the morning, and I had a bad day. And so I was like, I've got to repent and put the phone down and leave it on the side, super practically. So.
Well, and I can just testify. So I worked under him. I was mentoring for him before he did this, and it was a very different pastor and mentor than after he started doing it. And that's what really convinced me I need to start doing this, as I was like, I love what I'm seeing, and just realizing that to sustain church planting and to sustain that and to sustain ministry, man, our people, they just want to see Jesus. They don't need us to spend 20 hours a week on a sermon. They need us to just have life in Jesus and to really love Him more than anything else. And that is our sermon, right? And so, yeah, it's been, that was a piece that really, like I said, saved me, helped me thrive, to see that transformation that helped me do mine.
First, thank you both for helping us really focus on discipleship. That's so core. I need to hear the other side too, in terms of structure, funding, and how does the model work, and what that looks like in terms of the process. What are the time frames and planning that you put in place? If you could speak to that, that would be helpful.
So for our church plant and our church planting sort of movement in the city, the structure that we came up with was because we're working in an urban poor community, it looks very different. So your general church planting model is support for 3 years or get the money for 3 years, and it's got to be self-sustaining. And like our West LA church plant, it kind of went along that model as well. But when we looked at all the information in the East Side, there isn't a non-Catholic church that the average size is about 40, and there isn't a self-sustaining pastor. We haven't find one yet. And so we had to wrestle with the finances of and we realized there's kind of two extremes. There's sort of the independent, kind of you're all on your own, eventually figured out on your own. And for our neighborhoods, that means pastors become bivocational. And they have the highest rate of burnout and divorce. Then on the other side is the codependent, where it's all taken care of by sort of a wealthier community or church. So what we established through lots of discussion and talk is that Epicenter Pasadena, I'm still on their staff, so they pay my salary, and then our folks in our church, Lincoln Heights, cover everything else that we want to do in terms of building and programs and stuff like that. And that's what's allowed us to get to the point where we're able to be a healthy church and we're able to reproduce. So our Enrique, our pastor, our new plant, he became eligible, and he's with Stadia for the first year, the LA church planting movement. And so they have given him the money for the first 3 years, and now we're currently talking to a couple of the churches that were a part of that, and they're understanding the model and considering long-term kind of as a gift to the community and in the church. So it's sort of, we call it an interdependent model. And sort of the discussions that we've had over the years, which I've been so grateful for, John and the elders of Epicenter, they say this is our gift, our way of being generous with our stuff there. So,
yeah, let me just say something. I mean, some of you guys are part of denominations where people do that. We never had that. We're just a standalone church that we're trying to do this by ourselves. And so we just had to sort of figure it out. Over the last few years, I actually had a donor come and give us money. So now we have some funds set up for the next couple church plants we're going to be launching soon and so forth. But, we haven't had any institutional support. We just had to sort of figure it out ourselves. And, I think I calculated one day, I think we've spent more than $1 million trying to help their church over these last 10 years or so, just trying to get up and running. But we figured that's our contribution to the kingdom because God's blessed us to not be in their situation,
Yeah, we, doing this for so long, we've figured out that in neighborhoods like ours, like for example, Lincoln Heights, the average income is 3 times below the poverty level, which is in the top 5% of communities in LA. You need about 300 folks from the community giving to be able to pay for one pastor at a teacher level salary. So how do you get from 0 to 300 so you can't? And so this model actually has been really helpful for Stadia. And they're now scrapping the 3-year and done for neighborhoods because they want to plant in all of LA city neighborhoods, and they're realizing in certain neighborhoods the 3-year and done can work, but in our neighborhoods
Yeah, we're
not.
looking for 5 years.
Yeah.
We want to let you process this. We've kind of drunk deeply at this well of what you shared with us spiritually and ministry-wise. So I want to encourage you to now in your table groups to try to process that as openly as you're able to do at this time. But we feel like kind of learning happens when you actually, as Bobby Clinton used to say, expression deepens impression. That if you don't say something about what you've just experienced, it may not stay with you. So let me encourage you just to do that, and then we'll wrap up here just shortly at 2.